An evil spirit seizes him, making him scream. It throws him into convulsions, so that he foams at the mouth. It batters him and hardly ever leaves him alone. I beg your disciples to cast out the spirit, but they couldn't do it. Jesus said, "You faithless and corrupt people, how long must I be with you and put up with you?" Then he said to the man, "Bring your son here." As the boy came forward, the demon knocked him to the ground and threw him into a violent convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the evil spirit and healed the boy. Then he gave him back to his father. Awe gripped the people, and they saw this display of God power.
While everyone was marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to the disciples, "Listen to me and remember what I say. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies." But they didn't know what he meant. Its significance was hidden from them, so they couldn't understand it, and they were afraid to ask him about it.
Then his disciples began arguing aloud which of them was the greatest. But Jesus knew their thoughts, so he brought a little child to his side. Then he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me also welcomes my Father, who sent me. Whoever is the least among you is the greatest." Jesus answered and said, "Master, we have become sending out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent little because he does not follow along with us."
But Jesus said to him, "Do not hinder him, for he who is not against you is for you." When the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. But they did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. When his disciples James and John saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them and said, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went on to another village.
As they were walking along, someone said to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." But Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens to live in, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place even to lay his head." He said to another person, "Come follow me." The man agreed, but he said, "Lord, first let me return home and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Let the spiritually dead bury their own dead. Your duty is to go and preach about the kingdom of God." Another said, "Yes, Lord, I will follow you, but first let me say goodbye to my family." But Jesus told him, "Anyone who puts a hand to the plow and then looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God."
Morning to everyone. And thanks to our readers today for doing something different for our gospel reading. And it's a pretty long text. Is this on? Okay. That's good now? All right. Yes, it's a longer gospel reading, and yes, we're still in Luke chapter 9. If you've noticed, it's been probably 6 months that we've been in this chapter. So we're preaching through the Gospel of Luke, and here we are still in Luke 9, and it's a very, very rich text, a lot going on here. We also today we're debuting another new video from our kids, okay, that they've made, the kids on Wednesday night. So they'll come later in the sermon. And I was talking to Rebecca about that on Wednesday, because she's instrumental in making these cool projects happen, and she's like, well, the video is probably not the best one, like it doesn't really match the theme of Mother's Day that well. And I'm like, oh no, Mother's Day, I'm doing this horrible text from Luke 9 on Mother's Day. What should I do? She's like, well, just say, I guess the disciples should have listened to their mothers. So that's the message today. This is a sermon about what happens when you don't listen to your mother, okay? This is why they're failing in discipleship. So that was a sermon saver, thank you. There was, on Netflix this past Monday, there was released a new 4-part series called Lord of the Flies. And this was a 4-part television series for BBC or something like that, and they put it on Netflix. And it's very well done, very beautiful, artistic, cinematic. It's very beautiful. Obviously the book is going to be way better, but it's sort of an art piece showing Lord of the Flies instead of a full telling of the story of Lord of the Flies, So, it's a different, there's different goals there. But it still communicates the message of Lord of the Flies, which is one of my all-time favorite books. And in 1954, William Golding wrote this book. And not surprisingly, in 1954, he had a pretty pessimistic view of humanity and who we are at our core, at our nature as humans, right? Especially after what was happening in the previous decade. And it's a story about, it was in 1954, so sorry if you haven't read it yet, okay? I might tell you a little bit of the plot, but so these boys end up stranded on an island because of a plane crash. And all of the adults, the boys are like ranging from 6 to 12 years old, okay? And they're on this island, and all the adults have died. So what happens is these natural leaders emerge. They realize, as boys would, how utterly helpless you are in this situation on this island. You're powerless, really, in this situation. But the older kids take it upon themselves to organize and form leadership, and they have a system, and they have this symbol of authority in this conch shell, and a system that's seems to work at first. But eventually, there's a vying for who is the leader and who's the greatness, and there's factions formed and split, and territorial behavior and warfare, and eventually that leads to violence and just this devolution of what humans are plays out in this story about these boys on an island. And eventually you see in them the worst of what we are as humans. And that's what William Golding essentially thought, this is what we are as humans. Like, this is what we become. We can try to have these fake systems that keep us nice and civilized, but really at our core, we are like these boys who have this beast in them, which is a major theme of the book. Okay? But that progression from starting from this lack of power, moving into lack of wisdom and lack of humility and lack of sympathy and compassion, moving into violence and warfare and division. That is the story of humanity, and that is true. Now, whether or not that's at the core of our human nature, like Golding thinks it is, he's still telling a story that's true and accurately reflects the story of humans, not only in world history, but that can be the story of smaller groups as well on a smaller scale, right? And this is the experience that we see in Luke 9 of the disciples. They're reflecting that exact same tendency as humans. The same thing that is lived out in this novel, Lord of the Flies. And it begins with a lack. This whole narrative is showing the things that the disciples lack. And it begins with a lack of power and a false sense of their own human power to do something. This begins in Luke 9, chapter 37, that we read a little earlier before the sermon. The man comes with his son. His son's demon-possessed. A spirit is seizing him into convulsions. And in verse 40, I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. What happened at the beginning of Luke chapter 9? Jesus bestows them with all this power, all this authority to do this very thing, to cast out these demons. And they were doing it, and they had success. And now, 2 seconds later, something is different. Something has happened to them. Here is a real-world problem, a need, and a guy with his son who has a demon, and he asked the disciples, can you cast this out? And they couldn't. And so he comes to Jesus. Something has happened that is inhibiting the power that Jesus gave them. And the text isn't clear on that, but you can see as these little vignettes stack up against each other consecutively that there seems to be a bit of a heart problem here. The heart can influence power, and as soon as Christians lack power, the power of God in their lives, that sets all of the rest of this in motion. All of the rest of these attitudes and characteristics of us as individuals, of us collectively as a church. And we've seen it over and over again in church history, congregations, movements. You see this over and over, time and time again. Once there is a loss of power, or lack of power, or an internalizing of power, saying we are the ones with power. And surely that must be something that the disciples were doing here. They developed an ego about it. Well, of course we can cast this out. We just did it. We just did 100 of these last weekend. Something's wrong with the heart here, and so they no longer have the power of God, relying on their own. And so Jesus gives him one of his strongest rebukes in the gospel. And in verse 41, and most scholars think this is addressed directly to the disciples here in their weakness. You unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? And then he says to the man, bring your son here. And then the greatness of God was on display. The greatness of God. Jesus understood power, where it comes from, and how to access it and use it. The next things that the disciples lack are understanding. The next section, beginning in verse 43, the second half of verse 43. Jesus says, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. Now, he just said pretty much that exact same thing last week in the sermon, right? He's talking about the Son of Man going to the cross, and we are to take up our cross and follow him, deny ourselves. He just said that, just said it. But now he says it again, and nobody understands what in the world he's talking about. Why is that? They did not understand the statement, it says. Well, they understood it 3 minutes ago, but no more. This is the thing that is set in motion when we first lose power. It triggers this cascade of events. Now that what used to be understanding and wisdom is disappearing. And I think it's kind of like asking the question, who hardened Pharaoh's heart? You read the text in Exodus, ultimately God is hardening his heart, right? But there's a million steps along the way where the text clearly says Pharaoh is hardening his own heart. This text here in Luke says the statement was concealed from them so that they would not perceive it. Well, this is one of the most important things to understand about Christianity. I don't think it's God's purpose to conceal this from the disciples. But like Pharaoh, when you harden your heart over and over again, eventually God is going to let you live in that state. And maybe even help you live in that state. There's a misunderstanding, a lack of wisdom that is set in motion by the disciples themselves. And eventually God joins in. That should give us great pause and fear as Christians. That it is possible to have something concealed from us that has to do with wisdom or understanding of the gospel of Jesus. And from that, we move on to, of course, when we lack power and we lack wisdom and we lack understanding. Now, like the boys on the island, we say, well, let's figure out who's the greatest, right? That seems like the next best idea. We don't need power. We're not going to pursue understanding or wisdom. We can't understand anything, and we don't have any power. So let's just figure out who's the best here, who's the greatest. And that's what they do. An argument, verse 46, started among them as to which of them might be the greatest. And it just keeps getting worse, you know. But Jesus understood this, so there's a lack of humility now. The ego is rising. Humility is thrown to the wayside. And so Jesus says, he brings the child over and says, whoever receives this child, verse 48, in my name receives me. In Matthew's gospel, in this scene, Jesus says, become like this child. Luke has a different emphasis here. Jesus says, whoever receives this child in my name receives me. This is about receiving. This is about understanding that this story is not about me and my greatness. It's about humbling myself and receiving, welcoming other people in. And children, different than how things are today, where children are highly esteemed and thought of as very important to society, wasn't that way in the first century. Children were kind of just, we'll wait until they become a real person when they grow up, right? They were marginalized along with many other categories of people in society. So to welcome a child is to welcome someone who's usually not welcomed in their society. Jesus is showing them what true humility looks like. And of course, there is the next section, verse 49 and following. Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow along with us. Not in our group. Now the exclusivity sets in. And pretty soon after that comes the question, should we call down fire from heaven on these people? And now the violence begins. And that progression from lack of power to lack of understanding and wisdom, to lack of humility, to lack of sympathy and compassion, to exclusivity, to building the gates and the borders and the boundaries, and then resorting to violence. That's a story as old as humanity itself. And the scary thing is that the disciples who are following Jesus are manifesting those same things. That same story, that same plot. And Jesus is slowly trying to get them to understand that there's a different way. And it's so hard to break them from this mold. This is the stuff that can happen to us. It happens to a million religious organizations and movements. You can see maybe it's not like violence and breaking out and murdering people, but you can see that progression happening even in our own history and in our own movement. That once there's a lack or misunderstanding of power, then goes the wisdom and the humility and the compassion. Then the walls come up and the exclusivity is featured and the boundaries are set. That can happen to all of us. But Jesus says at the end to follow him. And here, as we finish the text here in verse 57 and following, there are three examples of people saying, I would like to follow you, but. And Jesus wants to correct this whole section here, including the people who say, Jesus, I will follow you, but first. And he wants to help them understand that there can't be a but first if you're going to be a disciple of Jesus. It has to be the number one priority. And in this section, we'll point out in a second, there's some really interesting parallels and even more so throughout Luke's gospel and earlier in chapter 9. I'm not going to do a whole sermon on that. But there's parallels to the narratives and the stories of Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament. And I think these echoes help us to understand the story a little bit better. But first, we're going to take a special moment to watch the debut of our kids and the video they made, which, luckily for us, is actually a story about Elisha. And it's one that they worked hard on, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So it's a familiar story. I won't ruin it for you. It's a story in the King's narratives about Elisha. So let's take a watch here.
God is the best. Billy Bob and Timmy.
Oh, Billy Blob, you look so chopped.
You know what, Timmy? I'm tired that you always gotta be using your 2026 slang words like chopped, whatever that means, on me. I think it's time for you to be taught the Bible story of how Elisha got called bald by 42 boys. Once upon a time, there was a man named Elisha, and he was walking to Bethel. But on the way, 42 boys walked up to him, and they all said,
You're balding.
You're so bald, you look like an egg.
Yeah. Oldie.
Yeah, and your nose looks like a carrot, and your ears look like overdone tater tots.
Yeah.
and Elisha said,
In the name of the Lord, I curse you.
Wait, what? The boys got devoured by bears. And that's the story of how 42 boys got demolished by bears after calling Elisha a baldy.
No, Billy Blob, I've learned a lot today. And I think that next time I should use some better words and be a little more respectful. So thank you.
You know, if you ever have any more questions about the Bible, come to me because I have a lot of the answers. And maybe I can lend you one of my Bible books too.
Thank you, Billy Blob.
Thanks for watching. Bye.
All right, let's give them a hand. Very nice. Okay, so there are parallels in what Jesus is saying to that ministry and that work of Elijah and Elisha. In the text that we read this morning, verses 57 and following, Someone said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus said to him, foxes have holes, birds have nests, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Another said, follow me. He said, Lord, first permit me to go and bury my father. But he said to him, allow the dead to bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim everywhere the kingdom of God. Another also said, I will follow you, Lord, but first permit me to say goodbye to those at home. But Jesus said to him, no one after putting his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. Elisha was plowing with oxen when Elijah called him. That's the beginning. There's an echo of that. And Elisha literally says to Jesus, or to Elisha, he says, let me go and give my parents a kiss goodbye, and then I will follow you. That's what he says to him. And just those two alone, already we know that we're in the story of Elijah and Elisha. Now, you can dissect these verses and say, what does this mean? Isn't this kind of inconsistent with what Jesus would actually teach in real life? Are we really not allowed to bury our loved ones? And I think this is pretty much, it's hyperbole. Of course, Jesus respects, this is one of the biggest, most important things, honoring the dead in Jesus' Jewish religion. I don't think that he's really saying you don't need to do that anymore, or you can't do that anymore. But what the point being made here is about the demands of discipleship. The demands of discipleship and priority in our lives. That Jesus is even more demanding than Elijah was of Elisha. That Jesus has a higher standard and higher demands, even more so than Elijah. And there's, the calling down fire parallel that we see in the text here too. But all that is in service of this narrative of the disciples and Jesus trying to disciple them and bring them along, showing them time after time that this is not the way. There might be historical precedent for bringing down fire from heaven, like Elijah actually did. There might be historical precedent for, calling the bears in, like Elisha did. That's fine. That's not the way of Jesus. He's asking them to do something even more difficult, right? He's asking them to have a power that is manifest in wisdom and in understanding and in humility and in sacrifice and in sympathy and in compassion. That is the power that he's giving them. And when you understand that, then you're able to exorcise the demons and to do much more besides. Last week we talked about Hebrews 12 and about Jesus being not only the pioneer of our faith, but also the perfecter of it. And that word, we talked a lot about the pioneer part of it. The perfecter part, sometimes that word is translated as finisher as well. So I have a pretty good story about, or I don't like the story, but my kids like the story. We call it the finisher story. And we were, over New Year's, spending time with our family in some rented place that had a really big game room and a ping pong table. And it was the last day and we were about to check out and we were playing the last round of ping pong. And I think it was me against my two boys or something. But here it is. I'm going to win the game. And they hit the ball way up in the air, really high. And something rose up within me, this moment of anticipated glory and power and awesomeness. And I, in this this primal cry, that guttural cry that came out of me, I said, "The finisher!" And then I went to spike this ball and just destroy and decimate them. And I actually whiffed the ball. and then they won the game. So it was pretty. They like to bring that up every so often if I get too full of myself. But that's a good illustration for my faith. Maybe yours, I don't know, but certainly for me, whenever this ego and this pride and this glory wells up within me, and I think, well, I can just, I can finish this off, I can do it, I can complete it, I don't need any outside help or power. That's when the fall comes and the failures come. Jesus is the true finisher. He is the one that can perfect and finish the fragmented failures of our faith, like we talked about last week. He actually knows how to secure the victory. And it's not through ego and power like the boys on the island or like the disciples here, but it is through understanding and wisdom and humility and sacrifice. It is through compassion. Here, James and John, elsewhere called the sons of thunder, said, Lord, should we cast down fire from heaven to torch these people? That's what was going on in James' heart at the moment. That's where he was in his discipleship. But Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter, the author and the finisher of James' faith, did not give up on him. And he kept discipling, he kept calling and calling and calling. And eventually, James got it. Eventually, that understanding and that wisdom came. Eventually, that humility and compassion came. Eventually, that power was understood and perfected in him. And he understood the power of sacrifice. And James, in Acts chapter 12, it's reported that he was the first of any of the 12 here to be martyred. He died for his faith. He became like Jesus. Over time, he learned the way of Jesus, the humility and the sacrifice, the wisdom and the compassion. He learned. Jesus perfected it in him. Jesus finished it in him. And that is the hope for all of us. Wherever it is that we are along the road of discipleship, wherever our hearts are, and for us collectively as a church family, as a fellowship, this is the beautiful promise of the gospel, that Jesus continues to call and to call and to call, and he doesn't stop. And wherever we're starting, he has a place he's going to bring us. And we, like James, over time, can be changed, can be molded, can be transformed into the image of Jesus. And it's our prayer that we have that heart of James. That heart that's open and willing to be softened, to be touched, to be healed, to be empowered by the love of Christ. Let's stand and sing.